Picture this. You're sitting in a sterile courtroom watching your own family tear apart your father's legacy while a judge decides whether you deserve the crumbs they're willing to throw you. That's exactly where I found myself last Tuesday, clutching a folder that would either vindicate everything I believed about my father or destroy the last shred of respect I had for the people who raised me. What happened next still gives me chills, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why my siblings went from confident victors to handcuffed defendants in less than 20 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, though everyone calls me Jess. I'm 42 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've made my living as a forensic accountant. If you don't know what that means, think of me as a financial detective. When couples divorce and suspect hidden assets, when business partners think someone's cooking the books, when insurance companies smell fraud, they call me. I've traced missing millions through offshore shell companies, uncovered embezzlement schemes that would make your head spin, and testified in federal court against some of the most creative financial criminals you can imagine. My specialty is finding money that people desperately want to keep hidden. I can spot a manipulated spreadsheet from across a room, identify forged documents by their metadata, and follow paper trails that twist through dozens of banks across multiple countries. In my world, numbers don't lie, people do. And after 15 years of catching liars, I thought I'd seen every trick in the book. I was wrong. The most elaborate deception I've ever encountered wasn't hiding in some corporate boardroom or criminal enterprise. It was sitting at my family's dinner table for the past 5 years. It all started 4 months ago when my father, Robert Martinez, lost his battle with pancreatic cancer. Dad wasn't a wealthy man by most standards, but he'd built something solid over 4 decades of 12-hour days and calloused hands. Martinez Auto Parts and Repair started as a single-bay garage in 1985 when I was 3 years old. By the time he passed, it had grown into a thriving business with 8 full-time employees, a parts distribution network across Southern California, and a reputation for honest work that money can't buy. Dad owned the commercial building that housed the shop, plus our family home in Riverside where I grew up, and a small commercial property he'd bought as an investment. Nothing flashy, nothing glamorous, just the American dream built one satisfied customer at a time. The total estate was valued at roughly $1.2 million, which sounds like a lot until you realize it represented 40 years of 16-hour days, missed family dinners, and weekends spent under car hoods instead of at Little League games. I moved to San Diego 8 years ago when I started my forensic accounting practice. It wasn't about running away from family, it was about building something of my own, just like Dad had taught me, but apparently, my older siblings saw it differently. My brother Mike, 45, had taken over the day-to-day operations of the business 5 years ago when Dad's health started declining. My sister Jennifer, or Jen as we call her, had been helping with the books part-time for the past 3 years, though she'd never shown much interest in numbers before. The will reading 2 months ago should have been a solemn moment of closure. Instead, it felt like an ambush. Dad's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Foster, who'd handled the family's legal matters for over 20 years, gathered us in his oak-paneled office overlooking the courthouse square. Mom sat quietly in the corner, her eyes red from crying. Mike and Jen flanked me on the leather couch, their expressions unreadable. Foster cleared his throat and began reading in that formal ceremonial tone lawyers use for such occasions. The family home would go to Mom, as expected. The business would be divided between Mike and Jen, which made sense since they'd been running it. But then came the shock. My portion of the inheritance was listed as $25,000, not 25%, $25,000. Out of a $1.2 million estate, the silence in that room was deafening. I sat there processing what I'd just heard while my siblings exchanged glances that seemed to say they'd expected this all along. $25,000, less than what Dad probably paid in insurance premiums last year, less than the cost of the transmission rebuild equipment Mike had bought for the shop 6 months ago, less than Jen spent on her family's vacation to Hawaii last summer. Foster continued reading, explaining that the bulk of the estate would be split between Mike and Jen, with Mom retaining lifetime rights to the family home. There was language about my career success and independent financial stability, and how Dad wanted to support the children who had dedicated themselves to preserving the family legacy. Each word felt like a slap in the face. After the reading, I pulled Foster aside and asked to see the original will. He produced a document dated just 18 months ago, bearing Dad's signature and properly witnessed. Everything appeared legitimate, but something felt wrong. Dad and I had talked about the business just 6 months before he died. During one of my visits home, he'd mentioned wanting to make sure everyone was taken care of fairly, and had asked detailed questions about business valuations and tax implications. Those weren't the questions of someone planning to leave one child virtually nothing. That night, I drove the hour back to San Diego in a fog of confusion and hurt. $25,000. The number kept spinning through my head like a broken record. It wasn't about the money itself. My forensic accounting practice was doing well, and I didn't need Dad's money to survive. It was about what that number represented. It said I didn't matter. It said my 8 years in San Diego had somehow disqualified me from being a real member of the Martinez family. It said that despite everything Dad had taught me about fairness and integrity, when it came time to put his values on paper, I'd been found wanting. I spent the next 2 weeks telling myself to let it go. Maybe Dad really had felt that way. Maybe I had been absent too often, too focused on my own career, to properly honor the family business. Maybe $25,000 was exactly what I deserved. But then my professional instincts started nagging at me. In my line of work, when something doesn't add up, it usually means someone's trying to hide something. I started with public records, which anyone can access online, property transfers, business filings, tax assessments, all the boring paperwork that tells the real story of someone's financial life. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 months before Dad died, there had been a flurry of activity. The commercial building had been transferred into an LLC called Rivera Properties, named after Dad's longtime business partner, Carlos Rivera. The business itself had been restructured, with Mike and Jen listed as equal partners, and Dad's ownership stake reduced to 40%. Most troubling of all, there had been a significant withdrawal from Dad's business account just 6 weeks before his death. $50,000, moved to a personal account I'd never heard of. When I traced that account, I discovered it belonged to Jennifer Sullivan, my sister Jen. The timing was suspicious, but not necessarily illegal. Maybe Dad had given her money for the family.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His expenses during his illness. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation, but my forensic training has taught me that when you find one irregularity, you keep digging until you find them all. So I kept digging. I contacted Carlos Rivera, Dad's business partner for over 20 years. Carlos was a good man, honest and straightforward, and he'd always treated me like family. When I asked him about the property transfer, his confusion was genuine. He told me Dad had mentioned wanting to protect the building from probate complications, but had never explained the details. Carlos had signed the papers because Dad asked him to, trusting that his old friend knew what he was doing. That conversation confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Dad hadn't been making these decisions alone. Someone had been advising him, guiding him through a complex restructuring of his assets in the months before his death. Someone who understood just enough about estate planning to be dangerous, but not enough to avoid leaving traces. I called Dr. Sarah Kim, Dad's oncologist, during his final months. Professional ethics prevented her from sharing medical details, but she could confirm general information about his cognitive state. What she told me was crucial. Dad had been mentally sharp almost until the very end. The pain medication had affected his energy and mood, but not his decision-making ability. Right up until his final week, he'd been asking detailed questions about treatment options and planning for the future. This wasn't a man whose judgment had been compromised by illness or medication. Armed with this information, I made a decision that would change everything. I filed a formal contest of the will in Riverside County Probate Court. It's not something you do lightly. Challenging a will can tear families apart permanently, and there's always the risk that you'll lose and be stuck with massive legal bills. But sometimes, when the alternative is living with injustice, you have to take the risk. The response from my family was swift and brutal. Mike called me that very evening, his voice tight with anger. How could I dishonor Dad's memory by dragging the family through court? How could I be so greedy that $25,000 wasn't enough? Didn't I understand that I'd forfeited my right to the family business when I moved away and abandoned everyone? Jen was even worse. She sent a long venomous text message accusing me of being jealous of their success, of never caring about the family until there was money involved, of being a vulture circling Dad's grave. She reminded me of every family gathering I'd missed, every birthday party I'd attended by phone instead of in person, every time I'd chosen my career over family obligations. Mom stayed silent, which was somehow worse than the accusations. Her silence felt like agreement, like confirmation that maybe I really was the selfish daughter who'd gotten exactly what she deserved. The local newspaper picked up the story within a week. Family feud over auto shop fortune, read the headline in the Riverside Press Enterprise. They painted it as a classic tale of greed and sibling rivalry, with quotes from Mike and Jen about how disappointed they were in my money grab. The story mentioned my forensic accounting background, but framed it as evidence that I was a calculating opportunist who knew how to manipulate financial documents. I hired Thomas Wright, one of the best probate attorneys in Riverside County. Tom was a quiet, methodical man in his 50s, who specialized in will contests and estate disputes. He listened to my concerns, reviewed the documents I'd gathered, and agreed that there were enough irregularities to warrant a formal investigation. But he also warned me about the emotional cost of what I was undertaking. The discovery phase of a probate contest is like performing surgery on your family's finances. Every bank record, every business transaction, every financial decision made in the years before death gets scrutinized under a microscope. Tom's team requested 5 years of bank statements, business records, medical files, and personal correspondence. What we found painted a picture of systematic manipulation that was far more sophisticated than I'd initially suspected. The key breakthrough came when we discovered a series of meetings between Dad, Mike, and Jen in the months before his death. These weren't casual family gatherings. They were formal sessions with an estate planning attorney named Rebecca Chen, someone I'd never heard of, despite being involved in family financial discussions for years. Chen had been hired specifically to restructure Dad's assets, and according to her billing records, Mike and Jen had been present for every meeting while I'd been deliberately excluded. The paper trail showed a clear pattern. Assets had been systematically moved out of Dad's name and into structures that would benefit Mike and Jen, while minimizing my inheritance. The commercial building transfer to Rivera Properties was just the beginning. They'd also established a family trust that I wasn't included in, moved Dad's business ownership into an entity they controlled, and even arranged for his life insurance beneficiaries to be changed. Most damning of all, we found email exchanges between Mike and attorney Chen, discussing minimizing Jessica's expectations and ensuring the business stays in the right hands. There were references to my financial independence and my lack of commitment to the family enterprise. They had literally conspired to cut me out of my father's legacy while he was dying of cancer, but the smoking gun was still hidden. Despite all the evidence of manipulation and conspiracy, The will itself appeared legitimate. Dad's signature was genuine, the witnesses were credible, and the document had been properly executed. Without proof that Dad had been coerced or deceived, proving undue influence would be nearly impossible. That's when I remembered something Dad had told me years ago about his approach to important documents. He was old school, a man who'd grown up when a handshake meant something and people's word was their bond. But he was also careful, especially when it came to legal matters. Always have a backup plan, Misha, he used to say. Never put all your eggs in one basket. I started thinking about where Dad might have kept important documents, not just the obvious places like his safe or filing cabinet, but the hiding spots he'd used when I was a kid. Dad was a creature of habit, and some habits die hard. I remembered him keeping spare cash in an old coffee can in the garage, important papers in a waterproof box buried in his closet, and his most valuable tools locked in a cabinet that only he had the key to. That's when I decided to search the family home one more time. Mom was staying with Jen temporarily while she decided what to do with the house, so I had access during the day. I spent hours going through Dad's personal effects, looking for anything the attorneys might have missed during their initial inventory. I found it in the last place I looked, taped to the bottom of his old toolbox in the garage, wrapped in plastic and sealed with electrical tape. It was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Dad's careful script, dated just 2 weeks before his death. At the top, in capital letters, he'd written Amendment to Last Will and Testament. My hands shook as I read the words my father had written in his final days. It was a complete reversal of everything in the formal will. The handwritten amendment left the business equally divided among all 3 children, with specific provisions ensuring that I would have an equal voice in all major decisions. The commercial building would go to me outright, in recognition of the financial sacrifice I'd made by helping to pay off the mortgage during Dad's illness. But the most powerful part wasn't about money, it was about love. Dad had written a personal message explaining that he'd discovered the deception and manipulation of his previous will, and that he wanted to ensure his beloved daughter Jessica received her fair share of the family legacy. He wrote about being proud of my career, about understanding why I'd moved to San Diego, and about wanting me to know that distance had never diminished his love. The amendment was properly signed and dated, with Dad's signature exactly matching samples from that time period. But more importantly, it was accompanied by a note explaining that he'd hidden it because he couldn't trust certain people to honor his true wishes. He'd even included specific details about family conversations and memories that only he would have known, making it impossible to claim the document was forged. I sat in that dusty garage, holding my father's final message, tears streaming down my face as I realized what had happened. Dad had discovered Mike and Jen's scheme. He'd learned that they were manipulating him, cutting me out of the inheritance, and using his illness as cover for their betrayal. And in his final weeks, when he was too weak to fight them openly, he'd found a way to ensure that the truth would eventually come out. The court hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend deciding whether to reveal the amendment immediately or wait for the dramatic moment. My attorney Tom advised me to present it early, to avoid any appearance of theatrics or manipulation. But something inside me wanted my siblings to have their moment in court. I wanted them to feel confident, secure in their deception, before the truth came crashing down around them. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that makes everything look washed out and depressing. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I wore for federal court appearances, and drove to the Riverside County Courthouse, with the amendment safely locked in my briefcase. The probate court was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly green. Judge Patricia Hawthorne presided from an elevated bench, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression suggesting she'd heard every possible variation of family greed and betrayal. Mike and Jen sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney Rebecca Chen, the same woman who'd helped orchestrate the original deception. They looked confident, dressed in expensive suits, and wearing expressions of wounded righteousness. Mom sat in the gallery behind them, her face carefully neutral. I took my place at the defendant's table with Tom Wright, feeling like David facing Goliath, with nothing but a slingshot and absolute faith in the truth. Chen stood first, her voice smooth and professional as she outlined their case. I was a distant daughter who'd abandoned the family business, moved away for selfish reasons, and was now trying to profit from my father's death. She painted me as a manipulative opportunist who couldn't accept that actions have consequences, that my choice to prioritize career over family had rightfully cost me my inheritance. She presented financial records showing my substantial income from my accounting practice, arguing that I didn't need the inheritance money while Mike and Jen had sacrificed their own career opportunities to preserve the family legacy. She showed photos of family gatherings I'd missed, birthday parties I'd attended by phone, and Christmas celebrations where my chair sat empty. The performance was masterful, designed to make me look like a greedy outsider trying to steal from the people who'd actually earned their inheritance through loyalty and sacrifice. Chen even produced testimony from family friends and business associates confirming that Mike and Jen had been devoted children, while I'd been notably absent during Dad's final illness. When it was my turn to present, I stood slowly and looked directly at my siblings for the first time since entering the courtroom. Mike's jaw was set in that stubborn expression I remembered from childhood arguments. Jen looked smug, confident that justice was finally being served. Neither of them had any idea what was coming. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Everything my family has said about my career and my choices is true. I did move to San Diego. I did miss family gatherings. I did build a life outside the family business. But what they haven't told you is that my father understood and supported those choices. And what they definitely haven't told you is that my father discovered their scheme to steal my inheritance and took steps to prevent it." I opened my briefcase and withdrew the amendment, along with copies I'd had professionally authenticated the day before. "Your Honor, I'd like to present newly discovered evidence that completely contradicts the will being probated today." The change in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and electric. Chen jumped to her feet, objecting that no new evidence had been disclosed during discovery. Judge Hawthorne raised her hand for silence and motioned for me to approach the bench. I handed her the amendment and watched her face change as she read my father's words. Her eyebrows rose, her lips tightened, and her eyes moved back and forth across the page with increasing intensity. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Wright," she said to my attorney, "is this document properly authenticated?" Tom stepped forward with a folder full of verification documents. "Yes, Your Honor, we've had the handwriting analyzed by 3 independent experts, all of whom confirm it matches samples of Mr. Martinez's writing from the same time period. We've also verified the paper and ink types, both of which are consistent with materials Mr. Martinez had in his home office." Judge Hawthorne studied the documents for several more minutes before looking up at the courtroom. Her voice when she spoke carried an authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "Bailiff," she said calmly, "please secure the courtroom. No one enters or leaves without my permission." The words hit the room like a bomb blast. Mike and Jen both turned pale, while Chen began frantically shuffling through her papers, as if she could find some legal precedent that would make this all go away. Mom gasped audibly from the gallery, finally understanding that something much bigger than a simple inheritance dispute was unfolding. "Miss Chen," Judge Hawthorne continued, "I'm going to need you and your clients to remain available for questioning. Bailiff, please contact the district attorney's office and request that an investigator be sent to this courtroom immediately." The next 20 minutes were a blur of whispered conferences, frantic phone calls, and the gradual realization that what had started as a probate hearing was becoming a criminal investigation. The amendment didn't just prove that I deserved my fair share of the inheritance, it provided evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse that could send my siblings to prison. When the district attorney's investigator arrived, Judge Hawthorne read the amendment aloud for the record. My father's words filled the courtroom, his voice somehow present despite his absence, telling the truth that Mike and Jen had tried so hard to bury. He wrote about discovering their betrayal and deception, about being heartbroken by their willingness to steal from their own sister, and about his determination to set things right, even if he couldn't live to see it happen. The investigator moved quickly, placing Mike and Jen under arrest for fraud and conspiracy. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Mike finally looked at me with something other than anger. For just a moment, I saw the brother I'd grown up with, the boy who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold reality of what he'd chosen to become. Jen was crying as they led her away, mascara streaming down her cheeks as she protested her innocence. She kept saying it was all a misunderstanding, that they'd only been trying to protect the family business, that Dad would have wanted it this way. But her words rang hollow in the face of Dad's written testimony about their cruel manipulation of his final months. As the courtroom emptied and the chaos subsided, I found myself alone with Judge Hawthorne and my attorney. The amendment had accomplished more than just restoring my inheritance. It had exposed a conspiracy that had torn our family apart and dishonored my father's memory. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would take years to fully understand. Judge Hawthorne looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Miss Martinez," she said quietly, "your father was a wise man. He knew that truth has a way of surfacing, even when people try their hardest to bury it." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. In the end, Dad had protected me one final time, reaching out from beyond the grave to ensure that his values of fairness and integrity would outlive those who'd tried to corrupt them. The $25,000 had become $1.2 million, but more importantly, my father's love had proven stronger than my siblings' greed. As I walked out of that courthouse into the gray afternoon, I realized that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, it's the knowledge that you were truly loved, and that love was strong enough to survive even death itself. Part 2. The foreshadowing setup. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, wearing the mask of concern, speaking the language of family loyalty, and convincing you that your instincts are wrong. As I sat in that sterile courthouse waiting room 3 weeks after filing my will contest, surrounded by the institutional smell of floor wax and broken dreams, I had no idea that what I was about to discover would make my $25,000 inheritance look like pocket change, compared to the magnitude of deception my family had orchestrated. The courthouse in downtown Riverside had seen its share of family feuds over the decades. Built in 1956 with that mid-century optimism that believed justice could be dispensed as efficiently as factory goods, it had weathered everything from divorce battles to custody disputes to inheritance wars that split families down generational lines. But even by those standards, what was brewing in the Martinez family probate case was something special. The clerks had started whispering about it during their coffee breaks, and the bailiffs exchanged knowing looks whenever our case number appeared on the docket. Thomas Wright, my probate attorney, had warned me that challenging a will wasn't like arguing a parking ticket. These cases had a way of consuming everything in their path, turning family dinners into legal strategy sessions and childhood memories into evidence for cross-examination. But I'd spent 15 years as a forensic accountant watching families destroy themselves over money, and I thought I understood the stakes. I was wrong. I understood the money part, but I'd completely underestimated how far people will go to protect a lie once they've invested their entire identity in maintaining it. The discovery process had begun 2 weeks earlier, and already the volume of documentation was staggering. 5 years of bank records, business files, medical records, personal correspondence, and financial statements were being fed into the legal machinery that would determine whether my father's will represented his true intentions or something far more sinister. My siblings had hired Rebecca Chen, a sharp-dressed attorney from Los Angeles, who specialized in estate defense and had a reputation for turning grieving families against each other with surgical precision. Chen's strategy was becoming clear from the depositions and document requests flowing across Tom's desk. She wasn't just defending the will, she was systematically dismantling my character, my relationship with Dad, and my right to be considered a legitimate member of the Martinez family. Every missed birthday party, every business meeting I'd attended by phone instead of in person, every career decision that had taken me away from Riverside, was being weaponized into evidence of abandonment and betrayal. The local media had picked up the story with the enthusiasm of reporters who smell a juicy family feud brewing. The Riverside Press Enterprise ran a series of articles with headlines like "Daughter Challenges Father's Final Wishes" and "Auto Shop Empire Sparks Family War." They interviewed former employees who described Mike as a dedicated son who'd sacrificed his own ambitions to keep the family business running, while painting me as the ambitious daughter who'd traded family loyalty for financial success in the big city. What made the media coverage particularly painful was how much of it was true. I had moved to San Diego to build my forensic accounting practice. I had missed family gatherings because of work commitments. I had made career decisions that prioritized my professional growth over family obligations. But what the newspaper articles didn't capture was the complexity of those choices, the encouragement Dad had given me to pursue my dreams, or the financial support I'd quietly provided to keep the family business afloat during its rough patches. The depositions began on a Tuesday morning in Chen's downtown Los Angeles office, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who wasn't comfortable with power and money. Mike went first, spending 4 hours painting a picture of his devoted service to Dad and the family business while I was off playing accountant in San Diego. His testimony was careful, rehearsed, and devastatingly effective at portraying me as the selfish daughter who'd forfeited her inheritance through neglect and indifference. Jen's deposition was scheduled for the following day, and I sat in the back of the conference room watching my sister transform into someone I barely recognized. The Jen I'd grown up with was emotional, impulsive, and wore her heart on her sleeve. The woman testifying under oath was controlled, calculating, and ruthlessly focused on justifying every dollar of the inheritance she and Mike stood to receive. She spoke about Dad's disappointment in my choices, about his concern that I'd become too removed from family values, and about his desire to leave the business to children who would honor his legacy. What struck me most about both depositions was how consistently their stories aligned. These weren't spontaneous recollections of family dynamics, they were carefully coordinated narratives that had been polished and refined until they gleamed like courtroom gold. Every anecdote, every example of my alleged selfishness, every instance of their supposed sacrifice had been crafted to support a single thesis. I had chosen career over family, and Dad had simply acknowledged that choice in his will. The documentary evidence Chen was producing seemed to support their version of events. Bank records showing my substantial income from forensic accounting work while Mike and Jen struggled with the modest salaries the family business could afford. Email exchanges between Dad and Mike discussing business decisions while I was notably absent from the conversation threads. Photos from family gatherings where my empty chair served as a visual reminder of my priorities. But as I reviewed the documents Tom's team was gathering for our response, I began to notice patterns that didn't fit the narrative my siblings were selling. There were gaps in the financial records, inconsistencies in the timeline of Dad's estate planning decisions, and a curious absence of documentation for several significant business transactions that had occurred in the months before his death. My forensic training had taught me that when people are telling the truth, their documentation is messy but consistent. When they're constructing a fiction, the paperwork is often too clean, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with their story. The first red flag was the timing of Dad's meetings with estate planning attorneys. According to Chen's filings, Dad had initiated the process of restructuring his will and business interests 18 months before his death, when his cancer diagnosis had prompted him to get his affairs in order. But when I cross-referenced those dates with Dad's medical records, I discovered that his prognosis at that time had been relatively optimistic. His oncologist had been talking about treatment options and planning for recovery, not preparing for death. The second red flag was the complexity of the financial restructuring that had preceded the will's execution. Dad had always been a straightforward man who preferred handshake deals to legal documents and simple solutions to complicated ones. The idea that he would voluntarily embark on a complex reorganization involving LLCs, trusts, and asset transfers seemed completely out of character, unless, of course, someone had convinced him it was necessary. The third red flag was the most disturbing, a pattern of financial transactions that suggested someone had been systematically extracting value from Dad's estate while he was still alive. Small transfers that individually seemed reasonable but collectively painted a picture of assets being quietly diverted away from the probate process. The family business had issued unusual bonuses and consulting fees to Mike and Jen. The commercial building had been transferred to Carlos Rivera's LLC at below market value. Even Dad's life insurance policies had been restructured in ways that minimized the estate's cash position. I spent a weekend in my San Diego apartment spreading these documents across my dining room table, creating timelines and flowcharts that mapped the movement of money through the Martinez family finances. What emerged was a sophisticated scheme to minimize my inheritance, not by changing Dad's intentions, but by ensuring there would be less inheritance to distribute. By the time the will was executed, the most valuable assets had already been moved out of Dad's name and into structures that benefited Mike and Jen while legally excluding me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Dad's will, it was about a coordinated effort to rob me of my inheritance while Dad was still alive to authorize the transactions. And the most chilling part was that Dad might not have understood what was happening until it was too late. His trust in Mike and Jen had been weaponized against both of us, turning his love for his children into the instrument of his daughter's disinheritance. I called Tom Wright that Sunday evening and asked him to meet me first thing Monday morning. When I spread my analysis across his conference table, his expression grew progressively darker as he absorbed the implications of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just a will contest anymore, it was potentially a criminal fraud case involving conspiracy, elder abuse, and systematic theft from a dying man. The conversation that followed would prove to be the turning point in everything that came after. Tom explained that if my analysis was correct, we were looking at violations of federal elder abuse statutes, state fraud laws, and possibly RICO charges if we could prove a pattern of racketeering activity. The $25,000 inheritance dispute had morphed into something that could result in prison sentences for my siblings and complete forfeiture of their ill-gotten gains. But proving it would require more than financial analysis. We'd need to demonstrate that Dad had been deceived or coerced, that Mike and Jen had deliberately manipulated him, and that their actions had been intended to deprive me of my rightful inheritance. That meant we'd need access to communications between the conspirators, evidence of their planning process, and potentially testimony from witnesses who could describe Dad's true state of mind during his final months. The investigation that followed would consume the next month of my life and fundamentally change my understanding of the people I'd called family for 42 years. Because what we discovered wasn't just financial fraud, it was a betrayal so systematic and calculated that it made the inheritance dispute look like a minor disagreement between siblings who'd simply grown apart. Part 3, The Disruption. The call came at 6:30 in the morning on a Thursday that started like any other day in my San Diego apartment. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise paint the downtown skyline in shades of gold and amber when my phone buzzed with an unknown Riverside number. In my line of work, early morning calls usually meant one of two things: either a client had discovered their spouse was hiding assets, or law enforcement needed forensic analysis for a case that couldn't wait for business hours. I answered expecting to hear a detective or attorney on the other end. Instead, I heard Carlos Rivera's voice, tight with worry and barely controlled anger. Carlos had been Dad's business partner for over 20 years, a soft-spoken man with calloused hands and an old-school sense of honor who'd helped build Martina's Auto Parts from a single-bay garage into the thriving operation it had become. If Carlos was calling me at dawn, something was seriously wrong. "Jessica, Mija, I need to talk to you about something I found," he said without preamble. "Can you come to the shop this morning? There are things about your father's business that don't make sense, and I think you need to see them before anyone else does." The drive from San Diego to Riverside normally took about 90 minutes, but I made it in 75, my forensic accountant instincts screaming that Carlos had stumbled onto something significant. Martina's Auto Parts sat on a corner lot that Dad had bought in 1987, a low-slung building with 4 service bays and an office that smelled perpetually of motor oil and the industrial coffee that mechanics drink by the gallon. I'd spent countless afternoons there as a kid, doing homework at the parts counter while Dad and Carlos worked on engines that coughed back to life under their expert care. Carlos met me in the parking lot, his weathered face showing the strain of whatever had prompted his early morning call. We walked through the shop in silence, past the familiar workbenches and tool cabinets, into the small office where Dad had conducted business for over 3 decades. The desk was exactly as he'd left it, cluttered with invoices, parts catalogs, and the spiral notebooks where he'd tracked every transaction in his careful handwriting. "I've been going through the books," Carlos said, settling into Dad's chair with obvious reluctance. "Mike asked me to help him understand the financial situation, get ready for the transition. But Jessica, what I'm finding doesn't match what I remember about how we ran this business." He opened a ledger that I recognized as Dad's master account book, the handwritten record he'd maintained parallel to the computerized system Mike had installed 5 years earlier. Dad was old school that way, he trusted computers for convenience, but he kept paper records for truth. What Carlos showed me made my stomach drop. The numbers didn't match. Not by small amounts that could be explained by timing differences or accounting methods, but by significant sums that suggested someone had been systematically siphoning money from the business. According to Dad's handwritten records, the shop should have had nearly $80,000 more in its accounts than what appeared in the computerized system Mike managed. "Look at this," Carlos said, pointing to a series of entries from the previous year. "Your father recorded payments from 3 major insurance jobs, transmission work on fleet vehicles. Big jobs, good money. But when I check the computer system, those jobs show up as warranty work that paid much less." I leaned over the ledger, my forensic training automatically cataloging the discrepancies. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable. High-value jobs were being recorded in Dad's handwritten books at their actual amounts, but entered into the computer system at reduced values. The difference was being siphoned off before it ever appeared in the official business records. Carlos, who had access to the computer system, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Mike set it up, said it would make the books easier to manage. He and Jennifer are the only ones with passwords." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd realized he'd been naive about people he'd trusted like family. We spent the next 3 hours going through 5 years of records, and the scope of the theft became clear. Someone had been skimming from the business systematically, using the gap between Dad's handwritten records and the computerized books to hide the missing money. Conservative estimates suggested over $200,000 had been stolen, but the real number was probably higher. The method was sophisticated enough to avoid detection during routine operations, but sloppy enough that a forensic review would catch it immediately. Dad's declining health during his final years had created the perfect cover. He'd delegated more financial responsibility to Mike and Jen while maintaining his handwritten records out of habit rather than suspicion. By the time he might have noticed the discrepancies, he was too sick to investigate, and too trusting of his children to believe they would steal from him. "There's more," Carlos said, producing a file folder I didn't recognize. "I found this in your father's desk, locked in the bottom drawer. I had to get a locksmith to open it after Mike said he didn't have the key." The folder contained documents that changed everything I thought I knew about Dad's final months. There were printouts of bank statements showing the stolen money being funneled into accounts belonging to Mike and Jen. There were email exchanges between my siblings discussing how to manage Dad's oversight of the business finances. Most damning of all, there was a handwritten note from Dad himself, dated just 6 weeks before his death. "I think Mike and Jen are stealing from the business," the note read in Dad's careful script. "The numbers don't add up, and they won't let me see the computer records anymore. They say I'm too sick to worry about business, but I'm not too sick to add. Jessica needs to know what they're doing. She'll understand the numbers." I sat in that familiar office, surrounded by the tools and memories of Dad's life's work, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family dynamics, or who had been the most devoted child. This was about theft, fraud, and elder abuse perpetrated by the people Dad had trusted most. The note was dated February 15th. Dad had died March 22nd. That meant he'd spent his final 5 weeks knowing that his son and daughter were stealing from him, knowing that they were betraying his trust, and knowing that he was too weak to stop them. The emotional cruelty of that realization hit me like a physical blow. "Carlos, why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" I asked, though I already understood his position. "I hoped I was wrong," he said quietly. "I hoped there was an explanation that didn't involve your brother and sister being thieves. But the more I dig, the worse it gets. And Misha, if they were stealing from the business, what else were they stealing?" That question would haunt me for the next week as I expanded my investigation beyond the business records. If Mike and Jen had been systematic enough to skim money from the shop for years, they'd certainly been positioned to manipulate Dad's personal finances as well. And if they'd been willing to steal from a dying man, there was no limit to what other deceptions they might have orchestrated. I drove back to San Diego that afternoon with Carlos's evidence secured in my briefcase and a growing certainty that the will contest was about to become something much bigger. The $25,000 inheritance that had seemed like such an insult now looked like the final piece of a puzzle that stretched back years. Mike and Jen hadn't just cut me out of Dad's will, they'd been systematically looting his assets while he was alive, leaving him with less to bequeath so that my smaller share would be less noticeable. That evening, I called Tom Wright and arranged an emergency meeting for the following morning. The evidence Carlos had discovered transformed our legal strategy from defending my character to prosecuting a criminal conspiracy. But more than that, it vindicated the instincts that had driven me to challenge the will in the first place. Dad hadn't abandoned me, he'd been trying to protect me from children who'd proven themselves unworthy of his trust. The meeting with Tom the next morning was unlike any attorney consultation I'd ever experienced. When I laid out the evidence of systematic theft from the family business, Tom's expression moved from professional interest to genuine alarm. This wasn't just about probate law anymore, we were looking at potential federal charges that could send my siblings to prison for decades. "Jessica, you need to understand what you're holding," Tom said, studying Dad's handwritten note for the third time. "This is evidence of ongoing financial abuse of an elderly person, conspiracy to commit fraud, and possibly RICO violations if we can establish a pattern of racketeering. Your siblings aren't just fighting over your inheritance, they're facing the possibility of serious prison time." The implications hit me in waves. The family feud over Dad's will had morphed into a criminal investigation that would destroy what remained of the Martinez family name. Mike's children would grow up knowing their father was a convicted felon. Jen's marriage might not survive the scandal and financial ruin. Mom would have to live with the knowledge that 2 of her 3 children were thieves who'd stolen from their dying father. But overriding all of those concerns was a simple truth that my forensic training had burned into my professional DNA. When you discover evidence of a crime, you have a moral obligation to report it. The money mattered, but justice mattered more. Dad had trusted me to understand the numbers, and the numbers told a story of betrayal that demanded accountability. Tom outlined our options with the methodical precision of an attorney who'd handled his share of family financial crimes. We could continue with the will contest and use the theft evidence to support our case for undue influence. We could report the criminal activity to law enforcement and let prosecutors decide whether to file charges, or we could do both, pursuing civil remedies while supporting a parallel criminal investigation. What would Dad want me to do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Based on what you've told me about him, I think your father would want the truth to come out, regardless of the consequences, Tom replied. He spent 40 years building a reputation for honesty and integrity. These revelations suggest he died, knowing that reputation was being destroyed by his own children. That afternoon, I made the phone call that would change everything. I contacted the Riverside County District Attorney's Office and reported that I had evidence of systematic financial abuse of an elderly person. The prosecutor who took my call sounded tired and overworked until I mentioned the dollar amounts involved and the sophistication of the scheme. Then her voice sharpened with the focus of someone who just recognized a career-making case. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, moved with surprising speed. Within 48 hours, a detective specializing in elder abuse cases was sitting in Tom's office, reviewing the evidence Carlos and I had gathered. Detective Maria Santos was a compact woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years listening to stories of families destroyed by greed. "This is good work," she said, after reviewing my financial analysis. "Very thorough. But to make criminal charges stick, we'll need more than business records and your father's note. We'll need evidence that your siblings knowingly deceived him, that they acted with intent to defraud, and that they understood the consequences of their actions." That meant the investigation was just beginning. Detective Santos would need to interview witnesses, subpoena bank records, and possibly conduct covert surveillance of Mike and Jen's activities. The criminal case would unfold parallel to the civil will contest, each one feeding evidence to the other, in a legal dance that could take months or even years to complete. But something told me we wouldn't have to wait that long. People who are desperate enough to steal from their dying father are usually desperate enough to make mistakes when they feel cornered. And Mike and Jen were about to discover that their carefully constructed deception was unraveling faster than they could contain it. The disruption was complete. What had started as a family disagreement over inheritance was now a criminal investigation that would determine whether justice could be served or whether the guilty would escape consequences through family loyalty and legal technicalities. Dad's final message was clear: Jessica needs to know what they're doing. She'll understand the numbers. I understood the numbers, and the numbers demanded justice. Part 4: The False Accusations. The counterattack came exactly 1 week after I'd filed the criminal complaint with the Riverside County District Attorney's Office. I was sitting in my San Diego apartment, reviewing client files for my forensic accounting practice, when my phone rang with a call that would demonstrate just how far Mike and Jen were willing to go to protect their stolen fortune. The voice on the other end belonged to a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, a woman named Patricia Vega, who covered white-collar crime and family legal disputes. Her tone was professional but carried an undercurrent of skepticism that immediately put me on guard. "Miss Martinez, I'm calling about allegations that have been brought to our attention regarding your conduct during your father's final illness," she said. "Several family members and business associates have come forward with serious concerns about your attempts to manipulate your father's financial decisions while he was weakened by cancer treatment." The world seemed to tilt sideways as I processed what she was saying. Somehow Mike and Jen had managed to flip the narrative, transforming themselves from thieves into victims and painting me as the manipulative daughter who'd taken advantage of a dying man. The sophistication of their response told me they'd been preparing for this possibility long before I'd discovered the truth about their crimes. "I'm not sure what you've been told," I replied carefully, "but I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about the facts of this situation." Vega's response suggested she'd been thoroughly briefed by sources who'd presented a compelling alternative version of events. According to her information, I had used my forensic accounting expertise to confuse and pressure Dad during his chemotherapy treatments, convincing him to sign documents he didn't understand and manipulating his medication-clouded judgment to gain access to family assets. The accusations were specific enough to sound credible and detailed enough to suggest insider knowledge. I had allegedly visited Dad during his weakest moments, bringing complex financial documents that I claimed required immediate signatures. I had supposedly threatened to cut off contact with the family unless he restructured his will to give me a larger inheritance. Most damaging of all, I had reportedly forged his signature on several documents, using my professional skills to create false evidence of his consent. These are serious allegations, Vega continued. Your siblings have provided medical records showing your father's cognitive impairment during his final months, along with testimony from healthcare workers who witnessed what they describe as your aggressive behavior toward a vulnerable elderly person. I felt sick listening to the carefully constructed lies that transformed my legitimate investigation into evidence of elder abuse. Mike and Jen had taken every fact about my forensic accounting background, my visits during Dad's illness, and my discovery of their theft, then twisted those facts into a narrative that painted me as the real criminal in the family. The most insidious part of their strategy was how they'd weaponized Dad's cancer treatment against me. Chemotherapy can indeed cause cognitive effects, and family members often do pressure dying relatives about financial matters. By claiming that I'd exploited Dad's vulnerability during his treatments, they'd created a story that sounded plausible to anyone who didn't know the true timeline of events. Miss Martinez, would you like to respond to these allegations? Vega asked. Your family's attorney says they're prepared to provide documented evidence of your fraudulent activities, including financial records that show suspicious transfers and forged signatures on estate planning documents. I realized I was facing a sophisticated media campaign designed to destroy my credibility before the criminal investigation could gain momentum. Mike and Jen were using the same tactics I'd seen in high-stakes corporate fraud cases: attack the accuser's credibility, muddy waters with competing narratives, and create enough doubt to make prosecution difficult. I'll need to review these allegations with my attorney before making any public statements, I said, ending the call before I could say something that might be taken out of context. The Los Angeles Times article appeared online that evening and in print the following morning. The headline read, "Forensic Accountant Accused of Elder Abuse in Family Inheritance Dispute," and the story presented Mike and Jen as grieving siblings who discovered that their father had been victimized by his own daughter during his final months. The article quoted Rebecca Chen extensively, describing me as a calculating opportunist who'd used my professional expertise to systematically deceive and manipulate a cancer patient for financial gain. Chen provided what she claimed were medical records showing Dad's declining cognitive function during the period when I'd allegedly coerced him into changing his estate plans. Most damaging were the quotes from supposed witnesses to my behavior. A nurse from Dad's oncology clinic described me as aggressive and demanding during family meetings about his care. A former business employee claimed I'd pressured Dad to sign documents during chemotherapy sessions when he was barely coherent from the medications. Even Carlos Rivera was quoted, though his statement seemed carefully parsed to avoid directly supporting the abuse allegations while not contradicting them entirely. The article's impact was immediate and devastating. By noon, 3 of my forensic accounting clients had called to express concerns about the allegations and suggested that perhaps it would be better to postpone our engagements until the legal issues were resolved. My professional reputation, built over 15 years of meticulous work and ethical conduct, was being systematically destroyed by people who understood that credibility is easier to destroy than to rebuild. The follow-up articles came in rapid succession over the next few days. Local television stations picked up the story, running segments about elder abuse in affluent families that featured my professional headshot alongside footage of the Martinez family business and solemn discussions about how financial professionals can exploit their expertise to victimize vulnerable clients. Mike and Jen appeared on camera outside the family business, presenting themselves as heartbroken siblings who'd only recently discovered the extent of their father's victimization. Mike, wearing a work shirt with the Martinez Auto Parts logo, spoke with practiced emotion about Dad's confusion during his final months and their growing concern about my influence over his decisions. We trusted Jessica because she was our sister and because she had professional credentials, Mike said, his voice breaking at exactly the right moment. We never imagined she would use those credentials to take advantage of our father when he was most vulnerable. Dad trusted her completely, and she betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Jen's performance was even more effective, presenting herself as the devoted daughter who'd spent Dad's final months caring for him while I was allegedly manipulating him for financial gain. She spoke about finding suspicious documents in Dad's papers, about his confusion when asked about financial decisions he supposedly couldn't remember making, and about their growing realization that I'd been systematically deceiving him. The hardest part is knowing that Dad died thinking Jessica cared about him, Jen said, tears flowing on cue. He never knew that she was stealing from him. He went to his grave believing that his daughter loved him, when really she just saw him as a source of money. The media campaign was supplemented by a carefully orchestrated social media assault that spread the abuse allegations across Facebook, Twitter, and professional networking sites. Someone had created fake accounts that shared the news articles with inflammatory comments about how forensic accountants couldn't be trusted and how professional credentials were being used to victimize elderly people. My business phone started ringing with reporters seeking comment, potential clients who'd reconsidered hiring me, and anonymous callers who wanted to express their disgust with my alleged crimes. I had to change my voicemail message to refer all media inquiries to Tom Wright's office and screen every call to avoid harassment from strangers who decided I was guilty based on news reports. The most painful part was watching the story spread through the professional forensic accounting community. Colleagues who'd known me for years began treating me with cautious distance, unwilling to associate themselves with someone under investigation for elder abuse. Professional organizations that had featured my expertise in their publications suddenly found reasons to cancel speaking engagements and remove my articles from their websites. Rebecca Chen had orchestrated a masterpiece of reputation destruction, using the media's hunger for sensational family disputes to create a narrative that protected her clients while destroying their accuser. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. If Jessica Martinez was revealed to be an elder abuser who'd manipulated her dying father, then any evidence she presented against Mike and Jen would be suspect. But Chen had made one crucial mistake in her campaign. The false accusations were so detailed and specific that they created a paper trail of lies that could be systematically debunked. Medical records could be cross-referenced with actual visit dates. Hospital staff could be interviewed about their recollections versus their quoted statements. Security footage from Dad's treatment facility could verify who was present during critical meetings. Most importantly, the allegations about my forging Dad's signature could be easily disproven through handwriting analysis and document authentication. If Mike and Jen were claiming I'd forged documents, they'd have to produce those documents and explain how their signatures had been authenticated by multiple experts. Detective Maria Santos called me 3 days after the Times article appeared, her voice carrying a mix of professional concern and barely controlled anger. She'd been investigating elder abuse cases for over a decade, and she recognized a sophisticated disinformation campaign when she saw one. "Jessica, I need you to understand something," she said. "This media blitz your siblings have launched actually helps our case more than it hurts it. They're making specific, detailed allegations that we can investigate and either prove or disprove. If they're lying, and the evidence suggests they are, then this whole campaign becomes additional evidence of their willingness to commit fraud." Santos explained that false accusations against crime victims were themselves criminal acts, particularly when they involved perjury, defamation, and obstruction of justice. By going public with detailed lies about my conduct, Mike and Jen had potentially committed new crimes that could be added to the charges already under investigation. "They're acting like people who are desperate and cornered," Santos continued. "Innocent people don't usually launch preemptive media campaigns to discredit the accusers. They answer questions, provide documentation, and let the facts speak for themselves. What your siblings are doing looks like a coordinated attempt to obstruct a criminal investigation." The detective's assessment gave me hope, but it couldn't repair the immediate damage to my reputation and business. I was fighting a two-front war, defending myself against criminal accusations while simultaneously trying to prove that the accusers were themselves criminals. The challenge was surviving long enough financially and professionally for the truth to emerge through the legal process. Tom Wright suggested that we needed to go on the offensive, using the same media channels that had spread the false accusations to present evidence of Mike and Jen's actual crimes. But media strategy required different skills than legal advocacy, and we'd need to be careful not to compromise the criminal investigation while defending my reputation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being accused of the exact crimes my siblings had actually committed. They'd systematically stolen from Dad during his illness, manipulated his trust for financial gain, and used his weakened condition to avoid accountability for their actions. By projecting their crimes onto me, they were hoping to create enough confusion and doubt to escape justice. But they'd underestimated both the strength of the evidence against them and the determination of a forensic accountant who'd spent her career catching people who thought they were too smart to get caught. The false accusations weren't just attacks on my character, they were challenges to my professional competence and personal integrity that I couldn't ignore. The battle for truth was about to begin in earnest, and Mike and Jen were about to discover that destroying someone's reputation is much easier than escaping the consequences of your own crimes. Dad had trusted me to understand the numbers, and the numbers would ultimately expose every lie they'd told about both of us. Part 5. The restraint moment. Standing in the conference room of Rebecca Chen's downtown Los Angeles law office, listening to my siblings destroy my character with the methodical precision of professional assassins, I experienced something I'd never felt before in 15 years of forensic accounting work. It wasn't anger, though I had every right to be furious. It wasn't hurt, though their words cut deeper than any scalpel. It was a crystalline moment of clarity, where everything became perfectly, terrifyingly clear. They thought they had won. The deposition was scheduled to last all day, with Chen methodically walking through every aspect of my relationship with Dad, my visits during his illness, and my alleged manipulation of his final wishes. Mike sat at the far end of the polished conference table, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes betraying the satisfaction of someone who believed he was watching justice being served. Jen sat beside their attorney, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissues that seemed more theatrical than emotional. Chen's questions came in waves, each one designed to build on the false narrative they'd constructed through their media campaign. She asked about my forensic accounting training, specifically how I'd learned to detect and exploit weaknesses in financial controls. She inquired about my knowledge of elderly cognitive decline and whether I'd observed signs of mental impairment in Dad during his chemotherapy treatments. "Miss Martinez," Chen said, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating witnesses, "isn't it true that your forensic accounting expertise gave you unique insights into how to manipulate an elderly person's financial decisions?" I looked across the table at my siblings, seeing in their faces the culmination of a deception that had probably begun years before Dad's death. This wasn't spontaneous greed or opportunistic theft, it was a carefully planned campaign to systematically loot his assets while positioning themselves as devoted children and me as the outsider who'd forfeited her rights through neglect and ambition. "No," I replied simply, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "That's not true." Chen smiled the way predators smile when they smell weakness. "But you did visit your father during his chemotherapy treatments, didn't you? During times when he was weakened by medication and less capable of making complex financial decisions. Every instinct I'd developed as a forensic accountant was screaming at me to fight back, to present the evidence I'd gathered, to expose the sophisticated fraud my siblings had perpetrated. But Tom Wright had coached me extensively about the importance of restraint during depositions. Anything I said could be used against me, and Chen was clearly hoping I'd lose my composure and say something that would support their elder abuse narrative. "I visited my father regularly during his illness because I loved him," I answered, keeping my tone even and professional. The same reason any daughter would visit her dying father. Chen consulted her notes with theatrical precision, making sure the court reporter captured every nuance of her performance. But these weren't social visits, were they? You brought financial documents to these meetings. You discussed estate planning during times when your father was receiving chemotherapy that affects cognitive function. The question was loaded with false assumptions and designed to make any honest answer sound incriminating. If I said yes, I'd be admitting to pressuring a vulnerable elderly person. If I said no, they'd produce evidence that I had indeed discussed financial matters with Dad and paint me as a liar. I discussed many things with my father during his illness, I replied. We talked about the family business, his concerns about the future, and yes, sometimes financial matters. That's what families do during difficult times. Mike leaned forward slightly, his face showing what I recognized as practiced concern. Jessica, you know Dad wasn't thinking clearly during those last months. The medications made him confused, forgetful. You took advantage of that confusion. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me during the deposition, and the calculated sadness in his voice was almost convincing. If I hadn't known the truth about what he and Jen had been doing, I might have actually felt guilty about my visits with Dad during his treatments. That's not what happened, Mike, I said, looking directly at him. And you know it. Chen intervened before the exchange could develop further. Miss Martinez, let's focus on specific documents. During your visits with your father, did you ask him to sign any financial papers? The question was a trap with multiple layers. They were fishing to see if I'd admit to obtaining Dad's signature on documents they planned to claim were forgeries. But they were also trying to establish a pattern of me pressuring him during his vulnerable moments. I never asked my father to sign anything, I replied truthfully. If he wanted to discuss business matters or estate planning, he brought up those topics himself. Jen made a soft sound that might have been a scoff or a sigh. When I looked at her, she was shaking her head with the expression of someone who'd heard one too many lies from a pathological deceiver. Jessica, that's just not true, she said, her voice cracking with emotion that seemed genuine until you noticed how perfectly it aligned with the narrative they were selling. I was there for some of those visits. I saw you pushing papers at Dad when he could barely keep his eyes open. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel with simple denials. Chen was building a record of family testimony that would make me look like a lying manipulator when contrasted with the grief and honesty of my siblings. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, 2 against 1, with the missing witness conveniently dead and unable to contradict their version of events. That never happened, I said quietly, and left it at that. For the next 4 hours, Chen systematically walked through every interaction I'd had with Dad during his final months, every phone call about business matters, every conversation about the family's future. She presented each innocent moment as evidence of manipulation, each expression of love and concern as calculated opportunism designed to position me for financial gain. The most painful part wasn't the false accusations, it was watching Mike and Jen nod along with each distortion, their faces showing the righteous satisfaction of people who believed they were finally exposing a dangerous criminal. They'd convinced themselves that their version of events was true, that I really was the selfish daughter who'd exploited Dad's illness for money. When Chen asked about my forensic accounting practice and whether I'd used those skills to deceive Dad about financial matters, I simply stated that I'd never mixed my professional expertise with family relationships. When she suggested that my success in catching financial criminals proved I knew how to commit financial crimes, I replied that understanding fraud helped me prevent it, not perpetrate it. The deposition broke for lunch at noon, and I found myself alone in the building's cafeteria while Tom Wright huddled with his associates to plan our afternoon strategy. Mike and Jen sat across the room with Chen and her team, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions that mixed pity and disgust. Sitting there picking at a sandwich I couldn't taste, I realized that this was what Dad must have felt like during his final weeks when he'd discovered their theft. The people he'd trusted most in the world had betrayed him so completely that he couldn't even comprehend the scope of their deception. The difference was that Dad had been too weak to fight back. I wasn't. The afternoon session focused on my alleged forgery of Dad's signature on estate planning documents. Chen produced handwriting samples and expert analysis that supposedly proved I'd created false documents to support my inheritance claims. She walked me through each question's signature with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a criminal case. Isn't it true, Miss Martinez, that your forensic accounting training included instruction in document authentication and handwriting analysis? Yes, it did, and wouldn't that training give you the skills necessary to forge someone's signature in a way that might fool casual observers? It would help me detect forged signatures, not create them. But the skills are essentially the same, aren't they? Understanding how signatures can be faked would logically give you the ability to fake them yourself. The logic was circular and designed to trap me in an admission that my professional expertise made me more capable of committing the crimes they were alleging. Chen was building a record that would allow her to argue that my forensic training was evidence of criminal capability rather than professional competence. My training helps me catch criminals, not become one, I replied. Jen leaned toward Chen and whispered something that prompted the attorney's next question. Miss Martinez, during your father's illness, did you ever help him with paperwork when his hands were too weak to write clearly? The question revealed the sophistication of their strategy. They were trying to establish that I'd had legitimate opportunities to handle Dad's signature, which would explain how I could have learned to replicate it accurately. Every act of daughterly assistance during his illness was being reframed as reconnaissance for future forgery. I helped my father with many things during his illness, I said. That's what families do. Including helping him sign documents when he was too weak to do so himself. If he asked for help, yes, I would never forge his signature, but I did sometimes guide his hand when the medications made it difficult for him to write. Chen made a note with obvious satisfaction. She'd just gotten me to admit that I'd assisted with Dad's signature during his illness, which could be twisted to support their forgery allegations. In their narrative, those moments of assistance had been opportunities to study his signing patterns and perfect my ability to replicate them. As the deposition continued into the late afternoon, I began to understand the full scope of what Mike and Jen had planned. This wasn't just about defending themselves against my inheritance challenge, it was about completely destroying my credibility so that any evidence I presented would be dismissed as the desperate lies of a proven elder abuser and forger. They'd prepared for this possibility long before I'd discovered their theft. The media campaign, the expert witnesses, the detailed timeline of alleged manipulation, all of it had been ready to deploy the moment I challenged their version of events. They'd turned my strengths into weaknesses, my professional expertise into criminal capability, and my love for Dad into evidence of exploitation. When Chen finally concluded her questioning near 5 o'clock, I'd spent 7 hours being systematically portrayed as a calculating predator who'd victimized her own dying father. The court reporter had captured hundreds of pages of testimony that made me sound like a monster, despite the fact that I'd answered every question truthfully and never admitted to any wrongdoing. Walking out of that conference room, I felt the weight of what I was up against. Mike and Jen hadn't just stolen money, they'd constructed an alternative reality where they were the victims and I was the villain. They'd invested so much in maintaining that fiction that they probably believed it themselves by now. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their elaborate deception. They'd assumed that I would break under pressure, that the false accusations and media campaign would drive me to make desperate mistakes or angry admissions that would support their narrative. They'd forgotten that I'd spent 15 years as a forensic accountant, dealing with people who lied for a living and thought they could outsmart the system. I didn't break, I didn't lose my temper, I didn't make admissions that could be twisted against me. I sat through 7 hours of character assassination with the patience of someone who knew that truth had a way of surfacing, even when people worked very hard to bury it. Tom Wright found me in the parking garage afterward, looking drained but determined. "How do you think it went?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "They're good," I admitted, "better than I expected, but they're also desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." The drive back to San Diego gave me 2 hours to process what I'd experienced and plan my next moves. Mike and Jen had shown their hand completely during the deposition, revealing the full scope of their strategy and the evidence they planned to use against me. Now I knew exactly what I was fighting, and I could begin to construct a defense that would expose their lies while protecting the truth about Dad's final months. The restraint I'd shown during the deposition wasn't weakness, it was strategy. I'd let them present their entire case without revealing any of the evidence I'd gathered against them. They thought they dominated the proceedings and established my guilt in the official record. What they'd actually done was commit perjury in a court proceeding while revealing the specific lies they were prepared to tell under oath. Detective Maria Santos called me that evening to discuss how the deposition had affected the criminal investigation. She'd received copies of the transcript and was analyzing the testimony for inconsistencies with the evidence her team had already gathered. "Jessica, I want you to know that everything your siblings said today can be verified or debunked through our investigation," she said. "If they're lying under oath about your conduct, that's additional criminal behavior we can pursue. They're not just stealing from your father anymore, they're obstructing justice and committing perjury." The detective's assessment confirmed what I'd suspected during the deposition. Mike and Jen were so committed to their false narrative that they were willing to commit new crimes to maintain it. Every lie they told under oath was evidence of consciousness of guilt, and every false accusation against me could be added to their growing list of criminal charges. That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing the deposition transcript and making notes about each false statement they'd made. The document would become a roadmap for proving their perjury, but more importantly, it revealed the psychological pressure they were under. People who are confident in their innocence don't construct elaborate lies about their accusers. They present facts, answer questions honestly, and let the truth speak for itself. Mike and Jen were acting like criminals because they were criminals. The sophisticated deception they'd constructed around Dad's estate was unraveling, and they were desperately trying to shift blame to avoid the consequences of their actions. But every move they made to discredit me was actually evidence of their guilt, and every lie they told under oath was another crime they'd have to answer for. The restraint I'd shown during the deposition was about to pay dividends in ways my siblings couldn't imagine. While they celebrated what they thought was a decisive victory, I was preparing to present evidence that would expose every lie they'd told and reveal the true scope of their betrayal of Dad's trust. They thought my silence during their accusations meant I had no defense. What it actually meant was that I understood something they'd forgotten. In the end, the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs revealing. And I was very, very good at revealing hidden truths that people desperately wanted to keep buried. The deposition was over, but the real battle for justice was just beginning. Mike and Jen had shown me their strategy, revealed their lies, and demonstrated their willingness to commit perjury to protect their stolen fortune. Now it was my turn to show them what a forensic accountant could do when she stopped being patient and started fighting back. Dad had trusted me to understand the numbers, and the numbers were about to tell a story that would destroy everything my siblings thought they'd accomplished through their elaborate deception. The restraint was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The morning of the final probate hearing arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. I stood in my apartment bathroom, adjusting the collar of my charcoal gray suit for the third time, knowing that in 3 hours everything would be decided. The evidence I'd gathered over the past 6 months was locked in my briefcase, but the most important piece of that evidence was secured in a separate folder that I carried like a talisman against the lies my siblings had constructed. The handwritten amendment Dad had hidden in his toolbox had been authenticated by 4 different handwriting experts, analyzed for paper composition and ink dating, and verified through linguistic patterns that matched his other personal writings. But beyond the technical verification, it carried something that no amount of expert testimony could replicate: the voice of a man who discovered betrayal in his final weeks and refused to let it stand. Detective Maria Santos had called the night before to update me on the criminal investigation that would follow whatever happened in probate court. Mike and Jen's financial records had revealed a pattern of theft that stretched back 5 years, involving not just the business skimming I'd discovered, but systematic looting of Dad's personal accounts, fraudulent insurance claims, and even the misappropriation of funds from a small scholarship he'd established for local students pursuing automotive careers. The scope of their crimes was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested they'd stolen over $400,000 from Dad while he was alive, using their positions as trusted children to manipulate banking relationships, forge authorizations, and cover their tracks through increasingly sophisticated financial maneuvers. They'd turned his love for them into a weapon against both of us, exploiting his trust right up until the moment he died. But perhaps the most damaging evidence wasn't financial, it was the digital trail of communications between Mike, Jen, and their attorney Rebecca Chen that showed the calculated nature of their deception. Email exchanges discussed managing Jessica's expectations, minimizing her access to information, and ensuring Dad doesn't get confused by too many voices in his ear. They'd literally conspired to isolate him from the daughter who might have protected him. The Riverside County Courthouse was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning, with multiple probate hearings scheduled, and the hallways filled with families arguing over inheritances, property disputes, and the complicated aftermath of death. I arrived 30 minutes early and sat in the back of Judge Patricia Hawthorne's courtroom, watching other cases conclude with the mechanical efficiency of legal proceedings that had become routine. Tom Wright joined me at the counsel table 15 minutes before our hearing, his expression carrying the controlled tension of an attorney who knew he was about to present a case that would either vindicate his client completely or destroy her irreparably. We'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating every argument Chen might make, and every piece of evidence she might present to discredit the amendment. Mike and Jen entered the courtroom exactly on time, flanked by Chen and 2 junior attorneys who carried boxes of documents designed to support their continued assault on my character. They looked confident, polished, and utterly convinced that they'd successfully painted me as an elder abuser whose claims should be dismissed without consideration. The gallery behind them was filled with people I recognized from the family business, employees, customers, and community members who'd known Dad for decades and had been convinced through the media campaign that I was a calculating predator who'd victimized him during his final months. Their presence was intended to demonstrate community support for Mike and Jen, while isolating me as the outsider who'd returned only to steal from her family. Mom sat in the front row behind my siblings, her face carefully neutral, but her body language suggesting she'd already chosen sides in this conflict. The woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me about right and wrong, who'd celebrated my achievements and comforted my failures, now looked at me like I was a stranger who might be dangerous if provoked. Judge Hawthorne called the case to order with the brisk professionalism of someone who'd presided over hundreds of family disputes and understood that money had a way of transforming loving relatives into bitter enemies. She reviewed the basic facts of the probate challenge, the allegations of undue influence, and the counter-allegations of elder abuse that had dominated the media coverage of our case. Chen stood first, her presentation polished and confident as she outlined the evidence against me. She described my alleged manipulation of Dad during his chemotherapy treatments, my supposed forgery of estate planning documents, and my calculated campaign to isolate him from the children who'd actually cared for him during his final months. "Your Honor," Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to swaying judicial opinion, "the evidence will show that Jessica Martinez systematically exploited her father's vulnerability during his cancer treatment to steal assets that rightfully belonged to his devoted children. This is not a case about inheritance rights, it's a case about elder abuse perpetrated by someone who used her professional expertise to victimize her own dying father." She presented medical records showing Dad's treatments and medication schedules, arguing that I'd deliberately visited during times when his judgment was impaired. She produced testimony from healthcare workers who claimed to have witnessed my aggressive behavior toward a vulnerable patient. Most damaging, she presented handwriting analysis that supposedly proved I'd forged Dad's signature on multiple documents. The presentation was masterful theater, designed to make me look like a monster who'd preyed on a sick old man for financial gain. Chen walked the judge through a timeline that painted every interaction I'd had with Dad as evidence of manipulation, every expression of concern as calculated positioning for inheritance fraud. Mike testified first, his voice breaking with practiced emotion as he described discovering the extent of my alleged crimes. He spoke about Dad's confusion during his final months, about finding suspicious documents that bore forged signatures, and about their growing realization that I'd been systematically deceiving him about financial matters. "Your Honor, my father trusted Jessica completely," Mike said, dabbing at his eyes with tissues that seemed perfectly timed. He never suspected that his own daughter would take advantage of his illness to steal from him. "We only discovered the truth after he died, when we started finding all these documents with signatures that didn't look right." Jen's testimony was even more devastating, portraying herself as the devoted daughter who'd spent Dad's final months caring for him, while I'd allegedly exploited his vulnerability. She described finding me alone with Dad during chemotherapy sessions, pressuring him to sign papers when he could barely keep his eyes open. Jessica would wait until Dad was at his weakest, Jen said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine grief. She'd bring these complicated financial documents and tell him they were just routine business papers. Dad was so trusting, he'd sign whatever she put in front of him because he believed his daughter would never hurt him. The testimony continued for 2 hours, building a comprehensive narrative of elder abuse that transformed my legitimate concern for Dad into evidence of criminal manipulation. Chen had prepared her witnesses thoroughly, and their stories aligned perfectly to support the version of events that painted me as the predator and them as the victims. When it was our turn to present, Tom Wright stood slowly and looked directly at Judge Hawthorne. "Your Honor, everything the court has heard this morning is an elaborate fiction designed to cover up one of the most systematic cases of financial elder abuse I've encountered in 30 years of probate practice. The real victim in this case was Robert Martinez, and the real perpetrators are sitting at the plaintiff's table." Tom's opening was deliberately understated, letting the judge know that we weren't going to fight emotion with emotion or accusations with counter-accusations. We were going to present facts, evidence and documentation that would expose the truth behind the carefully constructed lies. He began with the business records Carlos Rivera had discovered, showing the systematic theft that had been occurring for years before Dad's death. The handwritten ledgers in Dad's careful script told a story of growing awareness that money was disappearing from the family business, along with his increasing suspicion about who was responsible. "Your Honor, these records show that Robert Martinez was not a confused, vulnerable elderly person being manipulated by his daughter," Tom said. "He was a sharp businessman who discovered that his son and daughter were stealing from him, and was trying to protect his assets from further theft." The financial analysis I'd prepared was devastating in its clarity. Every transaction, every transfer, every consulting fee and family loan was mapped out with the precision of a forensic audit that had caught dozens of white-collar criminals. The pattern was unmistakable. Mike and Jen had been systematically looting Dad's assets while positioning themselves as devoted children and me as the absent daughter who'd forfeited her inheritance rights. But the smoking gun was the communications evidence Detective Santos had obtained through search warrants. Email exchanges between Mike and Jen revealed their awareness that they were stealing, their concern about getting caught, and their explicit discussions about how to manage the Jessica problem if I ever discovered their crimes. One email from Jen to Mike, sent just 3 weeks before Dad's death, was particularly damning. "Dad's getting suspicious about the missing money. We need to make sure Jessica stays out of the loop until after everything's settled." Once the will goes through probate, it won't matter what she finds. Another exchange showed them discussing how to use Dad's illness as cover for their theft. The chemo makes him tired, so he's not checking the books as carefully. We should move as much as we can while he's distracted by treatment. Tom presented the evidence methodically, building a case that demolished every aspect of their elder abuse narrative while revealing the true scope of their crimes. The handwriting experts who'd authenticated the amendment testified about the linguistic patterns that proved Dad's mental clarity during his final weeks. The medical professionals who'd actually treated him contradicted the testimony about cognitive impairment, confirming that he'd remained mentally sharp almost until his death. But the moment that changed everything came when Tom opened his briefcase and withdrew the folder containing Dad's handwritten amendment. The courtroom fell silent as he approached the bench, and I could see the confusion on Mike and Jen's faces as they tried to understand what new evidence was being presented. Your Honor, I'd like to present a document that Robert Martinez created in his final weeks, when he discovered the theft and deception that his son and daughter had perpetrated against him. Tom said, "This document represents his true final wishes, created after he'd learned the truth about his children's criminal behavior." Judge Hawthorne took the amendment and began reading, her expression growing more serious with each line. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of pages turning and the barely audible whisper of someone's nervous breathing. Dad's words filled the silence like his voice speaking from beyond the grave. "I have discovered that my son Michael and daughter Jennifer have been stealing from me for years. They have betrayed my trust, stolen money from the family business, and used my illness as an opportunity to steal even more. I am heartbroken that my own children would treat me this way, but I will not let them destroy what I've worked 40 years to build." The amendment continued with specific details about the theft he'd discovered, the methods Mike and Jen had used to cover their crimes, and his determination to ensure that his beloved daughter Jessica received her fair share of the inheritance they'd tried to steal from her. "Jessica has always been honest with me," Dad had written. "She moved away to build her own life, but she never forgot her family. When I needed help, she gave it without asking for anything in return. She deserves better than what her brother and sister have planned for her." Judge Hawthorne finished reading and looked up at the courtroom with an expression that had shifted from judicial neutrality to barely controlled anger. The amendment wasn't just evidence of Dad's true wishes, it was proof that Mike and Jen had been lying about everything, including their portrayal of him as a confused elderly man who'd been manipulated by his daughter. "Miss Chen," Judge Hawthorne said, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone sit up straighter, "I assume you're going to challenge the authenticity of this document." Chen stood slowly, clearly caught off guard by evidence she hadn't expected. "Your Honor, we'll need time to have our experts examine. The document has already been authenticated by 4 independent handwriting experts." Tom interrupted, "We have detailed analysis of the paper, ink, and linguistic patterns that confirm its authenticity. We also have supporting evidence that corroborates every factual claim Mr. Martinez made in his final statement." The judge studied the amendment for several more minutes before addressing the courtroom. "Bailiff, please secure the courtroom. No one enters or leaves without my permission." The words hit like a physical force, and I watched Mike and Jen's faces change from confusion to growing alarm as they realized that something fundamental had shifted in the proceedings. Chen began frantically shuffling through her papers as if she could find some legal precedent that would explain away what had just happened. "Miss Chen, your clients have just been accused by the dissident himself of systematic theft and elder abuse," Judge Hawthorne continued. "This document suggests that everything your clients have said about their father's mental state and their relationship with him has been fabricated. I'm ordering an immediate investigation into these allegations." The next 20 minutes were a blur of phone calls, whispered conferences, and the gradual realization that the probate hearing had become something much more serious. Detective Santos arrived with 2 other investigators, and Judge Hawthorne read Dad's amendment aloud for the official record. This case is no longer about probate law, the judge announced. This is now a criminal matter involving fraud, theft, conspiracy, and perjury. The evidence suggests that Michael and Jennifer Martinez have committed serious crimes against their father and have perjured themselves in this courtroom. Mike and Jen were arrested on the spot, their confident expressions replaced by shock and disbelief as handcuffs were applied and Miranda rights were read. Chen tried to protest that this was all a misunderstanding, that her clients had acted in good faith based on their genuine concerns about Dad's vulnerability. But Dad's own words had destroyed every aspect of their defense. He'd written about their theft with specific details that could be verified through banking records. He'd described their manipulation with clarity that contradicted all claims about his cognitive impairment. Most damaging of all, he'd expressed his love and respect for me while documenting his heartbreak over what Mike and Jen had become. As my siblings were led away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupted in confused whispers from the gallery members who'd come to support them. The employees and community members who'd believed the media narrative about my elder abuse were watching the people they'd trusted being arrested for the very crimes they'd accused me of committing. Judge Hawthorne invalidated the contested will and recognized Dad's handwritten amendment as his true final testament. The inheritance was redistributed according to his actual wishes, equal shares for all 3 children, but with Mike and Jen's portions held in trust pending the outcome of their criminal trial and the restitution they'd owe for their theft. The commercial building that Dad had specifically left to me was valued at $420,000, but more importantly, it represented his acknowledgement that I'd never abandoned the family. I'd simply chosen to build my own life while remaining loyal to the values he'd taught me. As the courtroom cleared and the legal machinery began processing the criminal charges against my siblings, I found myself alone with Tom Wright and the overwhelming realization that justice had finally been served. Dad's love had proven stronger than his children's greed, and his final act had been to protect the daughter who'd honored his memory by refusing to let the truth stay buried. The media coverage that followed was swift and comprehensive. The same reporters who'd painted me as an elder abuser now had to explain how the real victims had been Dad and me, while the supposed victims were actually sophisticated criminals who'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from their dying father. Rebecca Chen's law practice never recovered from the scandal of representing clients who'd committed perjury in her presence. The investigative reports that emerged revealed she'd either been complicit in their deception or negligent in verifying their claims. Either way, her career was effectively over. Mike and Jen eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and perjury. Mike received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, while Jen got 6 years due to her cooperation with prosecutors. Both were ordered to pay full restitution for the money they'd stolen, plus penalties and interest that would consume any inheritance they might have received. Carlos Rivera helped me rebuild the family business, which I eventually sold to him at a below-market price that honored Dad's friendship and loyalty. The proceeds went toward establishing the Robert Martinez Foundation, which provides financial assistance to families dealing with elder abuse and inheritance fraud. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from Mike, written from federal prison. He apologized for what they'd done and tried to explain the desperation and greed that had driven them to betray Dad's trust, but the letter felt hollow, like words written by someone who was sorry he'd been caught rather than sorry for what he'd done. Jen never wrote, never called, never acknowledged what they'd cost our family beyond the money they'd stolen. She'd chosen to maintain the fiction that they'd been victims of circumstances rather than architects of their own destruction. Mom eventually reached out, asking to meet for coffee in a neutral location where we could try to rebuild some kind of relationship. The conversation was awkward, painful, and incomplete, but it was a beginning. She admitted that she'd suspected something was wrong, but had been afraid to challenge Mike and Jen directly. Her regret seemed genuine, but trust was something that would have to be rebuilt slowly, if at all. The house where I'd grown up was eventually sold, with Mom moving to a smaller place closer to her remaining friends. I helped her with the financial arrangements, not because she asked but because it was what Dad would have wanted. Family loyalty shouldn't be conditional on perfection, and holding on to anger would only give Mike and Jen's crimes more power to destroy what remained of our relationships. Standing in that empty house for the last time, I found myself in Dad's old workshop, looking at the toolbox where he'd hidden the amendment that saved both our reputations. The space smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, familiar scents that brought back memories of weekend afternoons, when he'd taught me to change spark plugs and check tire pressure. He'd known I would find his final message eventually. Dad understood that forensic accountants are trained to look in places others might miss, to find evidence that people try to hide, and to follow paper trails until they lead to the truth. His trust in my abilities had extended beyond my professional skills, to his confidence that I would fight for justice when it mattered most. The amendment itself was now secured in a safe deposit box, but its words were burned into my memory. Jessica has always been honest with me. She moved away to build her own life, but she never forgot her family. She deserves better than what her brother and sister have planned for her. Those words represented more than an inheritance redistribution. They were a father's final testimony about the daughter who'd honored his values, even when those values led her away from the family business. Dad had understood that love doesn't require proximity, and that children can honor their parents by becoming the best versions of themselves, rather than staying in roles that limit their potential. The probate case was closed, the criminal sentences had been served, and the stolen money had been recovered through asset forfeiture. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was the knowledge that truth has a way of surfacing, even when people work very hard to bury it. Dad's legacy wasn't the money or property he'd left behind, it was the lesson that integrity matters more than profit, that family loyalty should never excuse criminal behavior, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let the guilty escape the consequences of their choices. I kept the family name Martinez and built my forensic accounting practice into one of the most respected firms in Southern California. The notoriety from the case had brought unexpected benefits. Families who suspected financial abuse began seeking my expertise, and my reputation for uncovering sophisticated fraud attracted clients dealing with complex inheritance disputes. The work gave me purpose beyond personal vindication. Every case where I helped expose financial predators, every family I protected from inheritance theft, every elderly person whose assets I recovered, felt like honoring Dad's memory and the values he'd taught me about fighting for what's right. Years later, when people asked about the probate case that had made headlines across California, I would tell them that it wasn't really about money or family dynamics or even criminal justice. It was about a father's love being strong enough to reach beyond death itself, protecting his daughter one final time from people who'd forgotten what family was supposed to mean. Dad had trusted me to understand the numbers, and the numbers had told a story of betrayal, theft, and systematic deception. But they'd also told a story of love, integrity, and the ultimate triumph of truth over lies. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, it's the knowledge that you were truly loved by someone who believed in your capacity for justice. The secret amendment had given me back my inheritance, but more importantly, it had given me back my father's voice, speaking clearly about who I was and what I meant to him. In the end, that was worth more than any amount of money my siblings could have stolen. The silence that followed Judge Hawthorne's order to secure the courtroom was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more powerful. The moment when lies collapse under the weight of truth and reality reasserts itself with brutal clarity. I watched my siblings' faces transform from confident satisfaction to dawning horror as they realized that their carefully orchestrated deception was crumbling in real time. Mike was the first to understand what was happening. His expression shifted from confusion to panic as Judge Hawthorne held Dad's handwritten amendment, and I could see him mentally calculating how much evidence we might have gathered. His eyes darted toward the exit, then to Rebecca Chen, then finally to me with a look that combined accusation and desperation in equal measure. Jen's reaction was different, but equally telling. She began crying immediately, but these weren't the calculated tears she'd used during her testimony. These were the raw sobs of someone who just realized that her entire future was disintegrating before her eyes. She clutched Mike's arm like he could somehow anchor her to the fiction they'd constructed, but even he was too busy processing his own terror to offer comfort. Detective Maria Santos entered the courtroom with two other investigators, their presence transforming what had been a civil proceeding into something far more serious. I recognized the lead detective as someone who specialized in financial crimes, and the federal agent behind her suggested that the case had already expanded beyond state jurisdiction. Judge Hawthorne read the amendment aloud in its entirety, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades listening to family disputes but had rarely encountered evidence this compelling. Dad's words filled the courtroom, like his presence speaking directly to the lies his children had told about his mental state and their relationship with him. I write this with a clear mind and heavy heart, the judge read from Dad's careful script. My son Michael and daughter Jennifer have betrayed my trust in ways I never imagined possible. They have stolen money from our family business, manipulated me during my illness, and planned to cheat their sister out of her rightful inheritance. I am dying, but I am not confused. I know exactly what they have done, and I will not let them succeed. The impact of those words was immediate and devastating. Every claim Mike and Jen had made about Dad's cognitive decline, every assertion that he'd been manipulated by medication, every suggestion that he'd been too confused to make sound financial decisions, all of it was demolished by his own clear testimony about their crimes. Chen jumped to her feet, attempting to challenge the amendment's authenticity, but Tom Wright was ready with documentation that had been prepared over months of careful investigation. 4 independent handwriting experts had verified the document. Paper and ink analysis confirmed it had been written during Dad's final weeks. Linguistic analysis proved the writing patterns matched his other personal correspondence from the same period. Most damaging of all, the amendment contained specific details about financial transactions that only someone with intimate knowledge of the family's business operations could have known. Dad had documented exact amounts, dates, and methods that Mike and Jen had used to steal from him. Details that no forger could have fabricated without access to the same evidence I'd uncovered through my investigation. Your Honor, Chen said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, even if this document is authentic, it represents the confused ramblings of a man under the influence of powerful pain medications. My clients have never denied that their father was sometimes paranoid and suspicious during his final illness. Judge Hawthorne's response was swift and decisive. Miss Chen, this document demonstrates remarkable clarity and attention to detail. It contains specific factual allegations that can be verified through banking records and business documentation. If your client's father was confused and paranoid, how do you explain his ability to accurately describe complex financial transactions that occurred over a period of several years? The question hung in the air without an answer because there was no answer that wouldn't incriminate Mike and Jen further. If Dad had been too confused to make rational decisions about his will, how had he been sharp enough to document their theft with forensic precision? If he'd been paranoid and delusional, why did his allegations match the evidence that independent investigators had discovered? Detective Santos stepped forward and addressed the court with the professional authority of someone who'd built dozens of financial crime cases. Your Honor, we've been investigating allegations of elder abuse and financial fraud related to this estate for the past 3 months. The document you've just read aligns perfectly with evidence we've gathered through banking records, business analysis, and witness testimony. We believe Robert Martinez was the victim of systematic financial abuse perpetrated by his son and daughter over a period of at least 5 years. The detective's statement transformed the courtroom atmosphere completely. This wasn't a civil dispute about inheritance anymore. It was a criminal proceeding with victims, perpetrators, and evidence of serious felonies. Mike and Jen were no longer grieving children fighting off their sister's greed. They were suspects in a complex financial crime that had targeted their own dying father. Santos continued her presentation with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent months building an airtight case. The investigation had uncovered over $400,000 in stolen assets, ranging from simple business account skimming to sophisticated insurance fraud involving fake claims and forged authorizations. The theft had accelerated during Dad's illness, with Mike and Jen using his declining energy as cover for increasingly bold financial manipulations. We've identified multiple instances where the defendants used their father's trust and declining health to steal money from his business accounts, Santos explained. They created false invoices for non-existent services, diverted customer payments to personal accounts, and even filed fraudulent insurance claims using their father's business information. The evidence was overwhelming in both scope and detail. Bank records showed systematic transfers from business accounts to personal accounts controlled by Mike and Jen. Email communications revealed their awareness of the theft and their discussions about how to avoid detection. Most damning, recorded phone calls had captured them discussing how Dad's illness provided the perfect opportunity to clean up loose ends before he died. But the smoking gun was a conversation recorded just 6 weeks before Dad's death, when Mike had called Jen to discuss what they would do if I discovered their scheme. The recording, obtained through a wiretap authorized during the criminal investigation, captured them discussing contingency plans that included discrediting me through false abuse allegations and destroying evidence of their financial crimes. "We need to make sure Jessica looks like the bad guy if this ever comes out," Mike's voice had said through the courtroom speakers. "If we can convince everyone that she was manipulating Dad, nobody will believe anything she says about missing money." Jen's response was equally damning. "I've already talked to Rebecca about how to handle that. We've got plenty of evidence about Jessica being absent during Dad's illness. It won't be hard to make her look like she was taking advantage of him." The recording continued for several minutes, revealing the calculated nature of their deception and their willingness to destroy their sister's reputation to protect their criminal enterprise. They discussed specific lies they would tell about my behavior, evidence they would fabricate to support abuse allegations, and strategies for turning family members and community supporters against me. Judge Hawthorne listened to the entire recording with an expression of growing disgust. When it finished, she addressed Mike and Jen directly for the first time since the hearing began. "Mr. and Miss Martinez, you are accused not only of stealing from your father, but of conspiring to frame your sister for the very crimes you committed. This court finds probable cause to believe that you have committed multiple felonies including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and perjury." The judge's words were followed by the formal arrest process that transformed my siblings from plaintiffs in a civil case to defendants in a criminal prosecution. As handcuffs were applied and Miranda rights were read, the courtroom gallery erupted in confused whispers from family friends and business associates who'd come to support Mike and Jen based on the lies they'd been told. Chen attempted one last desperate legal maneuver, arguing that her clients should be released on bail pending a full investigation of the evidence. But Judge Hawthorne had heard enough lies for one day, and the severity of the charges combined with evidence of ongoing deception made bail inappropriate. "Chen, your clients have demonstrated a sophisticated ability to manipulate financial records, deceive family members, and fabricate evidence," the judge replied. "Given the flight risk they present, and the ongoing nature of their criminal enterprise, bail is denied. They will remain in custody pending arraignment on the charges filed by the district attorney's office." As Mike and Jen were led away in handcuffs, I experienced something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction or revenge, but a profound sadness for the family we'd once been, and the people they'd chosen to become. These weren't strangers who'd victimized Dad and me. These were the brother and sister I'd grown up with, who'd taught me to ride bikes and helped with homework, and shared countless family dinners around the table where we'd once been happy. The transformation of those childhood memories into evidence of a criminal conspiracy felt like a death in itself. The Mike who'd protected me from playground bullies, and the Jen who'd braided my hair before school dances had become people capable of stealing from their dying father and destroying their sister's reputation to cover their crimes. But Dad's amendment had made one thing clear: his love for me had never wavered, even when he'd discovered the depths of his other children's betrayal. His final act hadn't been about money or inheritance. It had been about ensuring that truth would ultimately prevail over deception, and that the daughter who'd honored his values would receive the recognition she deserved. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed, aided by the overwhelming evidence Santos and her team had gathered during their investigation. Mike and Jen were indicted on 17 felony counts, including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and perjury. Additional charges were filed related to their systematic theft from the family business and their attempts to obstruct the criminal investigation. Rebecca Chen faced her own legal troubles as the state bar investigated her role in the deception. Email evidence suggested she'd known about at least some of the false allegations against me, but had proceeded with the case anyway, raising serious questions about her professional conduct and potential criminal liability for filing false documents with the court. The media coverage that had once painted me as an elder abuser now focused on the sophisticated criminal conspiracy that Mike and Jen had operated for years. Investigative reporters uncovered additional victims, including elderly customers of the family business, who'd been overcharged for services, and veterans whose identities had been used to fraudulently apply for benefits that were diverted to accounts Mike and Jen controlled. The scope of their crimes extended far beyond what I'd initially discovered. They'd used Dad's business relationships to identify vulnerable elderly customers who could be exploited through inflated bills and unnecessary services. They'd manipulated insurance companies through false claims that generated thousands of dollars in fraudulent payments. They'd even stolen from the scholarship fund Dad had established to help local students pursue automotive careers. Each new revelation made it clearer that this hadn't been opportunistic theft driven by desperation, but a systematic criminal enterprise that had targeted anyone they perceived as vulnerable or trusting. Dad's illness had simply provided them with additional opportunities to exploit someone who'd loved them unconditionally. The trial began 8 months after their arrest, and I testified as the key witness for the prosecution. Sitting in that witness chair, looking across the courtroom at Mike and Jen in their orange jumpsuits, felt surreal in ways I couldn't have imagined. These were people who'd shared my childhood, who'd been present at every birthday party and holiday celebration, who'd once been the most important relationships in my life. But the evidence I presented was devastating in its clarity and scope. The financial analysis I'd conducted revealed every stolen dollar, every forged authorization, every manipulated transaction that had enriched them at Dad's expense. The timeline I'd constructed showed the acceleration of their crimes during his illness, and the communications evidence proved their awareness that they were committing serious felonies. Perhaps most importantly, I testified about Dad's handwritten amendment and what it revealed about his mental state during his final weeks. Far from being the confused, vulnerable elderly person they'd portrayed, Dad had been sharp enough to document their crimes with forensic precision and plan for justice, even after his death. Mike and Jen's defense strategy centered on portraying their actions as misguided attempts to preserve the family business during a difficult transition period. Their attorneys argued that any financial irregularities had been the result of poor record-keeping and miscommunication rather than intentional theft. They claimed that the charges against them were the result of a family dispute that had been blown out of proportion by prosecutors seeking a high-profile conviction, but the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss as miscommunication or family dysfunction. The recorded phone calls where they discussed their crimes, the forged documents they'd created to cover their theft, the systematic manipulation of Dad's trust during his illness, all of it pointed to a deliberate criminal conspiracy that had operated for years. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Mike was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, while Jen received 10 years due to her cooperation with prosecutors in identifying additional stolen assets. Both were ordered to pay full restitution plus penalties and interest that would consume any potential inheritance they might have received. The day of their sentencing was one of the most difficult of my life, not because of any sympathy for their situation, but because it marked the final end of the family I'd known growing up. The people being led away to prison were strangers wearing familiar faces, and their crimes had transformed every shared memory into something tainted by the knowledge of what they'd been capable of. But justice had been served, and Dad's faith in my ability to uncover the truth had been vindicated. The amendment he'd hidden in his toolbox had accomplished exactly what he'd intended, protecting me from their deception while ensuring that their crimes would eventually be exposed and punished. The financial recovery from their criminal activity allowed me to establish the Robert Martinez Foundation for Elder Protection, an organization dedicated to helping families identify and prevent financial abuse of elderly relatives. The foundation provided educational resources, investigative assistance, and legal support for families dealing with inheritance fraud and elder abuse. Carlos Rivera and I worked together to rebuild the family business, which I eventually sold to him, at below market value in recognition of his loyalty to Dad and his courage in coming forward with evidence of the theft. The proceeds from that sale funded additional programs through the foundation, extending Dad's legacy of helping others beyond anything he could have accomplished during his lifetime. Mom gradually rebuilt her relationship with me, though the process was slow and sometimes painful. She'd been genuinely deceived by Mike and Jen's lies, but her willingness to believe those lies without questioning them had contributed to the damage they'd been able to inflict. Trust, once broken, required careful reconstruction through consistent actions over time. The house where I'd grown up was sold, and Mom moved to a smaller place closer to her remaining friends. I helped her with the financial arrangements and the emotional process of sorting through decades of family possessions, many of which now carried complicated memories of the people we'd thought Mike and Jen were. Standing in Dad's workshop for the last time, surrounded by the tools he'd used to build his business and support his family, I felt the presence of the man who'd taught me that integrity mattered more than profit, and that family loyalty should never excuse criminal behavior. His final lesson had been the most important: sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let the guilty escape the consequences of their choices. The toolbox where he'd hidden the amendment remained in the workshop until the very end, and I kept it as a reminder of his faith in my ability to find the truth when it mattered most. Every time I looked at it, I remembered his words about how Jessica would understand the numbers, and how those numbers would tell the story that needed to be told. Years later, when people asked about the case that had made headlines across California, I would explain that it hadn't really been about money or inheritance or even criminal justice. It had been about a father's love proving stronger than his children's greed, and about the power of truth to survive even the most sophisticated attempts to bury it. The forensic accounting practice I built on the foundation of that case became one of the most respected firms in the region, specializing in inheritance disputes and financial elder abuse. Every family I helped protect from fraud, every case where I exposed hidden assets or uncovered systematic theft, felt like honoring Dad's memory and the values he'd taught me about fighting for what's right. The work gave me purpose beyond personal vindication and connected me to something larger than the individual injustices I helped resolve. Dad had trusted me to understand the numbers, but more importantly, he'd trusted me to use that understanding in service of justice for people who couldn't protect themselves. The secret amendment had given me back my inheritance, but its greater gift was the knowledge that I'd been loved by someone who'd seen the best in me, even when others had tried to convince him otherwise. In his final weeks, when Mike and Jen were working systematically to convince him that I'd abandoned the family, Dad had refused to believe their lies about who I was or what I meant to him. His handwritten words had reached across death itself to protect me from people who'd forgotten what family was supposed to mean. The document that had seemed like a simple estate planning correction was actually a father's final testimony about the daughter who'd honored his values by becoming the person he'd raised her to be. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the knowledge that you were truly loved by someone who believed in your capacity for justice. Dad's amendment had given me that knowledge, along with the resources and motivation to spend the rest of my life proving that his faith in me had been justified. The numbers had told their story, justice had been served, and truth had ultimately prevailed over even the most sophisticated deception. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. A father's love had proven stronger than death itself, reaching beyond the grave to protect his daughter one last time from people who'd lost their way. In the end, that was worth more than any amount of money Mike and Jen could have stolen, and more valuable than any inheritance they could have tried to deny me. Dad's final gift wasn't financial, it was the knowledge that I'd been worthy of his trust, his love, and his faith in my ability to carry his values into a future he wouldn't live to see. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.